My eyes snap open, and immediately I realize that despite an almost instant and steadily growing panic, I have absolutely no ability to move any part of my body. I am still in bed, still in my room, and everything around me is exactly as it was when I fell asleep an undetermined length of time ago. Everything, that is, but the pale blue-white illumination which seems to fill the chamber from an unseen and uncertain source. I feel deathly cold, and the urge to leap up is an overpowering emotional need which makes my paralysis that much worse. A scream is building deep in my chest, and yet it is as if I am buried in a bottomless well of silence and fear, unable to produce even the weakest movement or sound. The air around me is freezing, as if my window were open, and the callous bite of spiteful winter wind has filled not only the room, but my very being with its rage. However, this cold is no stranger to me. Its presence is so familiar now that I will never forget it. Each hair of my body standing straight from my skin in a wave of goose flesh is now experience of which I am well acquainted. There is something here in the room with me, and I cannot rise to flee or protect myself. As this realization occurs, like a burst of terror in my mind, I see her materialize in the air above me as I lay, unable to even tremble in my bed. She hovers parallel to my unmoving form, and every detail of her still lovely, once living face is clear and visible as she draws nearer and nearer, lowering down beneath the cracked plaster of my ceiling. Now her translucent pale white face is inches from my own, her long hair of indeterminate color flowing out from within the cowl of her hood like it were flowing in water, the strands reaching and moving as if to entangle me in their threads. Her eyes were shrouded in the shadow of her hood, but I could see her lips moving as if she was speaking, but I could not hear her words. Now, as I peered deep into the darkness where I knew her eyes to be, I began to hear her whispering. "Have you found the boy? Have you found the boy? Have you found the boy?" Each time the words grew louder, rising from whisper to mumble, mumble to utterance, and utterance to insistent, urgent chant. "Have you found him yet?" Her voice was desperate and angry. As the light which shone from her ghostly visage began to brighten like a cold flame growing in light, and its edge cutting like an icy fire. Slowly, as her persistently louder voice went from question to accusation, I began to see more and more of her face and expression beneath the cowl of her robe, and could now see that in place of small, shining, intelligent eyes I had seen at the church, there was now only two vacuous voids with empty, cavernous sockets. The face had become thinner and gradually more corpse-like, until only a horrid, glowing skull filled my vision as two pinpoints of light began to appear deep inside the craters of her eyes. "You haven't even been looking! Worthless, lazy, apathetic wretch! You must find him, watchman! You must find the boy! You will never know peace. I will never let you know peace, wretched, sniveling watchman." louder and louder, her voice filling my mind with a hateful, broken emotion. Find the boy! Find the boy! You must find the boy! The light shining from where her eyes should be was blinding, cruel, and overpowering, as it seemed as if the apparition were going to crawl into my mind and fill it with her rage and loss. She screamed other things I could not comprehend. All I could see, all I could feel, and all I knew was the pain of the priestess of Athenda, whose name I still did not know. I fought relentlessly against the overwhelming waves of sorrow, hate, and despair which washed over me as the ghost seemingly enveloped me in her presence. And finally, I screamed. I could see her mouth moving, but I could no longer hear her words over my own terror. Leaping up from the bed, I tripped over my sister's ancient hound, Barnabas, who had been nestled comfortably on the blankets which I had tossed to the floor in the fits of my sleep. He yelped loudly, and I cried out in a shrill surprise as I toppled brutally to the floor like a tree cut down by a woodsman. A concerned tongue began lapping against my face as I heard the angry voice of my sister raging from the room below me. "Again with the screaming? Bloody hell, Tilly! Are you a damned infant?" I could hear her pounding footsteps as she climbed the stairs, and still face down on the floor, I watched as the door flew open and her boots stomped across the room, before a small but strong female hand clamped its fingers onto my ear and raised me up from my prone state as if my head were a teacup. "What the hell is wrong with you, Tills? Are you going mad? Has the watch finally drove you insane? Every day with the bloody screaming, I'm trying to get the baby to lay down. I'm sorry, Talia. I'm having these dreams." "Dreams? You're screaming like you're being murdered." She let go of my ear, but began jabbing me in the chest with a pointed finger to punctuate her words. I'm working on it, sis. It just takes time." "Whatever it is you need to do, hurry up and do it. I'm half tempted to kick you out onto the street." "Oh, you wouldn't do that, Talia. I'm your only brother." "Don't delude yourself. I don't love you that much, Tilinassus." I know, but you need my money for rent." She stared at me angrily, but I could see the flames cooling in her eyes. "Be that as it may, if this keeps up, I may beat you to death in your sleep. I swear to you, dear sister, that I will rectify the situation promptly, as I do prefer to sleep without paralysis and violent outbursts." I told no lies. At this point, I had become desperate to end the nightmare visitations I was receiving from the spirit of the priestess almost nightly. It had been over 2 months since the night at the chapel, and while I had originally seen the finding the cursing boy as a lower priority, it had emerged as imperative. Never had I had a spirit enter my dreams and torment me. At first, I thought that it was merely my own guilty conscience giving me bad dreams, but I was now certain that the entity was in fact somehow visiting my slumber. With a grimace and a shaking of her head, Talia whirled and left me as she had came, to answer the now crying infant below. I hurriedly began gathering my things and rushed to begin my day with guilty intent to end my torment. After the night in Plague Town, I had told myself that other pressing issues were at hand, besides that of the Cursling. A murderer was still at large. There had been yet another killing as the snow melted and the days grew longer. Spring had arrived, and 7 murders had been committed throughout the long months of the winter. The watch patrolled the streets constantly, but there was no discernible means of predicting the time and a place when the killer, who the papers had named the Dark Beach Flayer, would strike. The victims ranged from major members of the criminal underground to 3 members of the city government, including a judge, a city trade official, and now a major city council member slain in his own house. Councilman Xander Reese had been found displayed over the mantel of his study's fireplace as if he were a cleaned and killed hunting trophy. The killer most certainly had a reason and purpose, and yet both remained elusive. I knew there was a connection between all the victims, but I could not configure it. The criminal elements of the city were all astir, and many gangs were on the verge of open war, not only with each other, but of course the Watch, who had been deemed useless by all on every side of the issue. The papers issued daily articles and cartoons ranging from criticism to ridicule about the entire body of the town constabulary. Our nightly patrols were met with whispers, accusations, and at times the odd thrown object. The poor, though not the focus of the killer's attacks, still felt the weight of consequence as the enormous network of the Dark Beach underworld grew increasingly violent and defensive. On the other side, they also suffered the growing suspicion and paranoia from the upper crust of society, who had embraced rumors that the killer was some angry poor citizen or a group of citizen rebel anarchists. The Flayer, who had originally been a somewhat praised vigilante, had taken on a whole new dimension in the public eye. Parliament members had resorted to hiring private bodyguards, ranging from soldiers to the occasional wielder of art, to defend themselves and their homes. The scrutinized and dejected Watch crumbled beneath the weight of public judgment, while now operating under the theory that the murders had to be the actions of a powerful magic user. We were advised to maintain a close observation over what had to be a skilled sorcerer of some sort to have committed crimes so horrendous while maintaining discretion and lack of witness. This, in fact, had been enough to cast a shadow over the Stoneland Metaphysical Society, and indeed my mind often went to this suspicion, and was the major reason why I had not yet asked for their aid in finding the Cursling and catching the murderer. The very idea filled me with a sickening feeling of anxiety, of which I could not completely account for. "Do you truly think they could be responsible?" Patrick whispered, as he stood beneath the gas lamp across the street from the Society's office. It was the early hours of morning, and the street was silent and devoid of presence but for us. "Look, I don't want to think they are, but there's a lot of things suggesting they might be involved. First of all, timing. This started right after they arrived. Secondly, they are powerful wielders of art, and we've seen it. Well, we've also seen them help people." He sighed wearily, and who stated the main reason why the entire city had not turned on the Stoneland Society, as being outsiders would normally have been more than enough reason for them to be suspect. However, over the weeks they had ingratiated themselves into almost all corners of society. The members were among the number of those professionals who had been employed by the aristocracy as protectors. Annis, Ravnissa, and Dabrias had made numerous appearances at the sides of council at sport and theatre and celebration. As for the lower class, the society had aided in the finding of missing children and lost items. They were sought after for divinations and consultations of matters of the supernatural. There was now somewhere to go for help with the prodigious hauntings besides the watch, and society could actually help beyond anything we had ever been able to provide. Mr. Fisher had himself become a sort of celebrity and was now a member of our club downtown. His bizarre appearance was now considered exotic, and he a fascinating foreigner. He could be found often playing billiards or swimming in the pool in evenings. Ludwig had been invited to the university as a guest lecturer, and I'd heard tell they might offer him a position. Lady Marin was now a common sight at the hospital, clinics, and charities. To suggest that the Stoneland Society were criminals responsible for murders would be tantamount to self-destructive for the watch. I began to hear familiar tap of rain droplets on the brim of my hat as lightning flashed across the dark morning sky. Spring storm, I stated dully. So, why can't we ask them for help? Patrick questioned as we began to walk. Because I just have this feeling, Pat. Like getting involved with them is like walking into a spider's web. They helped us, Tilly. You can't deny it. I don't deny it. But they just give me the feeling of being very small and powerless. Like they are part of something very large and overwhelming. Fine, then. Tell the ghost tomorrow night that she's shit out of luck because you're scared to ask for help. He smiled wryly and chuckled. He knew I was desperate. She's driving me mad, I shivered, just thinking of another nocturnal encounter with the priestess. Sounds like quite the quandary, mate, he laughed, gripping my shoulder roughly and giving me a slight shove, which in my current state might have been enough to drop me to the cobblestones. Let's ask Eldon what he thinks then. He said this as if I did not know what that would mean. Eldon would, of course, say we should go to the society of whom he was fascinated. Our friend Eldon, we had discovered through much investigation, lived in one of the poorest rundown neighborhoods of the city borough known as Shoutless Shore. Residing down by the ocean front, quite close to the docks and harbor square, within quick walking distance of both his beloved libraries and gambling halls as well. His home, so to speak, was in a section of buildings which I had always considered to be vacant, based on their ruinous, crumbling architecture. However, we would learn, to our surprise, that Mr. Bleak rented the entire upper floor of what I would have assumed was a vacant, deteriorating apartment building. One had to enter into the rotting aperture and begin to climb a seemingly endless purgatory of stairs while standing in a vast, cobwebbed, shadowy hallway on the top floor. The only indication of any presence of life besides vermin and insect residents was a relatively new, reinforced, iron-bound door which stood nondescript but oddly clean and dust-free in comparison to its fellows, which hung shattered and open on loose, rusty hinges. It was this door which we now stood in front of, as the first early embers of morning were burning in the distant sky. Patrick beat against the door mercilessly as I shouted, "Eldo! Wake up, lad, it's us!" at the top of my voice for several moments before we would cease and listen for response. It took almost 4 rounds of this to finally wrangle some sign of life from behind the thick oaken barrier. The high-pitched sound of Eldon's furious ranting could be heard, punctuated by a series of soft, padded footsteps pounding against the floorboards. The clicks of bolts, locks, and chains could be heard rapidly flung undone as his words became audible. "What in the great high spirits is wrong with you imbeciles? Have you no sense of time? Or do you simply assume the entire universe revolves around you and your damn fascist policies?" "We're not fascists, Eldon. We are public servants," Patrick declared as the door flew open, and we were greeted by a blast of warm air thick with scents of wine, incense, and still noticeable traces of hashish. Eldon stood nearly quivering with outrage in his nightgown and slippers as we whirled and charged off into the shadows of the living room in search of his robe. "I like that nightshirt, Eldo," I laughed. "My sister has one just like it, but you wear it much better." "You foul degenerates, awaken me at such an hour and then make jokes and laugh at me in my own home." Now wrapping his silken violet robe around himself defensively, he charged off towards the kitchen, which he frantically began the formulae of coffee-making. "No, lad, we're not mocking you, mate. We love you, Eldo. We couldn't wait to talk to you, mate." Patrick's voice purred with comfort and sincerity, as it did when he apologized. Eldon whirled and pointed at him with a profound accusation as he whipped his white rebellious locks back off of his glasses. "You mean you didn't want to wait until after I would have been awake later? Spirits forbid you might disturb your own precious schedule and exhibit some self-discipline, or imagine some respectful behavior." Patrick said nothing for a moment, but only lifted an empty wine glass from the dining room table and sniffed it casually as his eyes traveled over the wasteland of notebooks, papers, bottles, and ashtrays. "Self-discipline, you say?" He shook his head with a hilarious disapproval. "Yes, you have struck upon a chord," I said sadly. "We shall from now on strive to attempt to live at the high level of discipline and respect that you yourself have set as an example." Eldon rolled his eyes and hid a smile as he scavenged a coffee cup from a corner. Patrick began to wander about the vast open loft as if it were a touring museum. I walked over to the fireplace and tossed on 2 dried logs and poked the remnants of the previous to inspire a new blaze. As I stabbed at the orange coals, I almost leapt from my skin at the sound of a loud, clear musical notes ringing out in the wide open space. I wailed to see Patrick prodding away at a harpsichord he had found covered with a sheet in the corner. "Why are you hiding this piano?" he called out as he banged away at the black keys. "I'm not hiding it, and it's a harpsichord, not a piano, you simpleton." Eldon shouted as a tea kettle began to sing on the massive ancient coal stove. "I cover it from dust and damp. The air's quite sea-laden here." Patrick nodded with the dawning comprehension as he now sniffed the bowl of a long, ornate white clay pipe which lay on a table nearby. He met my eyes and quietly shook his head as if to answer my question. He mouthed the word hash and placed it back as I nodded, as if reading my mind answered my quandary that it was not opium. We worried about our new friend and his reckless pursuit of excitement, despite his nervous, somewhat fearful nature. "How did you get that bloody thing up here?" he asked as he poured steaming water into a large metal device, which I guessed made coffee. "I didn't," he answered groggily. "It was here already. Might possibly be the only reason I rent this place." "What do you mean?" Patrick now was walking up the stairs which led to yet another platform level of the loft. "I didn't particularly like this place, But when I toured it, I saw the harpsichord and took it as an omen that I was meant to take it. As it turned out, it met my needs wonderfully. Bloody hell, what is all this? Came Pat's exclamation from above. Be careful up there, Patrick. That's my lab. Don't touch anything. Balls, Tilly. He's got a damned workshop. Eldon now stepped into the living area from the kitchen with his steaming coffee in hand and gazed at me questioningly. Please, tell me there's a good reason you're here. I just went to sleep a few hours ago. There is, came Patrick back down the stairs. Can we have coffee, or will you not even offer, like some uncouth savage? Why are you here? Tilonassus is about to lose his mind, he explained casually. Tills, is this true? It is, I answered. We need help. With finding the killer? His eyes clearing and his tone steadying with interest. Well, yes, but actually, that's not what's driving him mad, Patrick mentioned thoughtfully. We've got to find that boy. I spoke with exhaustion. The Cursling boy? Eldon's eyes lit with fascination. The ghost is driving him mad. Patrick now sat in one of the large stuffed chairs and began rolling his tobacco thoughtfully. Are you sure it's actually the ghost and not a guilty conscience? At this point it matters not, for neither will relent. What we need, Mr. Bleak, is some basic insight into what our possible options might be. Patrick spoke as he leaned over and lit his yellow squib of cigarette on the table lamp. Your options in regard to what? Eldon turned and walked toward the area of the vast loft which appeared to be used as a sleeping quarters. Several long curtains were draped to form a makeshift wall across the south portion of the loft, where a piled mattress, pillows, and blankets could be seen within. In regards to possible occult avenues by which we may pursue our problems, I sighed, knowing fully well the reaction I expected to get in return. Are you asking me if magic might help you find the Cursling boy? I could not tell whether the shock in his tone was real or as if he was preparing to relentlessly mock us. And possibly put an end to these damned murders, Patrick added with the same look of acceptance mirrored from my face to his. Finally scraping the bottom of the barrel, eh, lads? Came his triumphant call. How many have been slain now before the watch might actually attempt to do something useful? Yes, he was most certainly going to mock us. The watch is still not considering it, I confessed wearily. Patrick and I are asking. But this is in no way affiliated with the main organization. Oh, well, that is a bit disappointing then. I had thought perhaps the city had finally broke down and admitted they need help. He reappeared from between the curtains like a magician taking the stage, wearing his bright blue striped vest and clean silken white shirt beneath. No, mate, just us. Well, that takes all the fun out of it. I knew you two were desperate in the first place. Look at the people you associate with. Patrick nodded in polite agreement. What exactly do you want to know? We don't really have a clear understanding of the art. Could you perhaps educate us? Of course. Where would you like to start? He stood before us like a school mom teaching the alphabet. How does it all work? Where does it come from? I took my pocket notebook out and prepared my stub pencil to take notes. As with most things in our modern human culture, it actually begins with the elves. Of course it does, Patrick moaned sarcastically. Eldon stopped and crossed his arms. Sorry, mate. Continue. Carry on. The elves had by their very nature the ability to bend the forces of nature which they worshipped. What we refer to as the art, the ancient elves called religion and spirituality. They worshipped all the different aspects of nature in various groups, or what you might think of as cults. There were those who venerated light, elements, lightning, and the winds, amongst other things. But they didn't have particular deities, I asked, and he shook his head, considering. No. That was a human invention, but even humans originally had but one great faith that flourished in the times of old, and that was the cult of the moon priests. However, even they were worshipping the moon in its different aspects. There were full moon priests, who were healers, half moon priests, who were orators and ministers, and then there was the dark moon priests, who studied the secret doctrines and hidden mysteries, which would also become a part of what we now call magic. Anyway, the elves had temples revering everything from animals to plants and dreams, and eventually this would lead to a major part of the undoing. How's that? They became very concerned over what forces the other groups were worshipping. The elves as a whole had begun to consider only certain forces of nature acceptable and other forces to be dangerous and wicked. There were amongst certain cultural groups of elves, in particular religions, which the main body had come to consider evil, as it were. There were a few cultural groups referred to as ghost elves and witch elves by their kin, who had long established cults which revered forces like death and darkness, even decay and entropy. I believe there was a main group that lived in an area they used to call Wraithheim, of whom there were main practicing faiths. They called them Wraith Elves, and had begun to not only question their practices, but actually shun them. So they were evil then? Patrick could no longer feign disinterest. This was not information that everyday folks like us were given privilege to. As Eldon was often quick to point out, the entire history of the elves had become a children's story or a myth in our world. No, they weren't any more inherently evil or destructive than the others, as far as I can tell. But they were a smaller cultural entity, and their customs and even their appearance was different than their cousins. The great elven kingdoms had become conceited and arrogant in their views and opinions. I think, most of all, they feared that their dark-oriented relatives were learning something different, more powerful. They were threatened by what they did not understand, and eventually these attitudes led to bigotry and even violence. Many of the great noble houses, which were the controlling government of the elven world, began to outlaw the practice of these faiths, and they began to deny that their power was divine at all. This was when the ideas of necromancy and spiritualism were first concocted and labeled. They had began the idea philosophically that not all of this energy was divine, and that these cults, these cultures, in fact, were outlawed. They started a war, Patrick whispered. Oh, many wars, in fact. They hunted those groups into hiding, and it didn't matter whether they observed these practices or not. It had become a bigotry. It was race wars, I said out loud, as I scribbled the words in my journal. Indeed. And that would just be the beginning of the destruction. A dusk fell over the elves, which would last centuries, and eventually plunge them into an endless night, because there was, in fact, something evil waiting in the shadows to reveal itself. Beings which were not part of the natural order and flow of nature and magic. There is much debate over who first turned to these beings for power, but the traditional elven groups point to the witch elves as the culprits. Even if that were true, it probably would have been done out of desperation to defend against the virtual genocide. Either way, dark entities of immense power would be given a foothold in the natural world. Demons, they called them, Patrick added. Indeed. They say the witch elves made deals with them, but I would think it was desperation and self-preservation. Either way, they were hunted almost to extinction. But don't they say that the northern countries were collapsed by demon worship as well? I asked, as I tried to remember the old stories they used to tell in school. Indeed, eventually, even anything resembling magic or the occult would be outlawed by the great northern commonwealths. The North people had developed a broken culture of nobility and slavery as well, and also had fallen under the sway of the dark spheres. Dark spheres. I stared at the words on my page. They seemed hauntingly familiar. In my mind, I could barely see a vague memory of a painting in the museum of a huge, dark looming. The Dark Mountain. Patrick once more pulled it from my mind, as he seemed to do sometimes. Yes, it all ties into the Dark Mountain as well. But I don't even know the full story. Our historians have quite successfully erased and buried the true past beneath a clear white coat of human culture. Nonetheless, wars were fought, countries collapsed, and knowledge was lost, or at least greedily captured. The elves fought with each other, and then fought with humans, and in time could not maintain their culture. They did not so much die out as they were bred in to human culture. There was a plague, wasn't there? I asked, looking up at Eldon, who had the strangest expression of worry. Yes, there was. And it only affected full-blooded elves. Only those people of mixed stock survived, and because the elves had such strict laws against inbreeding, they almost died out. What do you mean? The elves had sterilized children born from unions with other people so that they could not propagate. Then, these individuals were relegated to lives of servitude in their culture. The half-elves, or elf-blooded, as they were called, were not considered full citizens by many elven cultures. However, as the houses fell, they discovered ways to reverse the sterilization, and a new bloodline was created. The ones that they had feared a threat became the final saviors. And what of their religions? I asked, trying to understand how all of this related. What they called religion, we call magic. The moon priests were eventually crushed by new human empires threatened by their power, and the world became quite dark and faithless. However, certain individuals took it upon themselves to lead and save the ravaged fighting groups now left in the world. These great teachers showed the people that there were other spheres and an afterlife to be considered. Then eventually, these people passed on, but returned as spirits to give aid, power, and hope to their followers. The high spirits, both I and Patrick shared a look of hope, just at the thought of the many churches. Yes, in fact, they were but ghosts of martyred and wise people of various cultures and paths who stayed close to this world in order to save us from our directionless, bigoted fighting. And all the old teachings of the elves were forgotten and hidden until a few individuals began scraping away at the past to create what we now call the art. What elves called religion, we call magic. Correct. So, are there any of these teachings which might help us with our cause? I had begun to resharpen the point of my pencil with a dagger. There is, but I highly doubt that there is anything I personally can do to help. Higher levels of art are difficult and dangerous. We are not elves, and it does not come easily or cheap to us. I study at the most basic, simple levels, and even that can be risky. However, I believe we do know some individuals who exhibit gifts and abilities of a much more unique and ubiquitous quality. The Stoneland Society, I sighed. Indeed, I believe they can do the type of arts which you require. But can we trust them? Patrick, pulling on his auburn beard nervously. Can they trust you? Eldon refuted honestly, and I had no answer. If we had any reason to suspect that they were involved with the murders, then we would, of course, have to react in turn. We have to do something. I placed my notebook back in my pocket and reached for my snuff. What kind of art are we discussing? Patrick dropped the butt of his cigarette into an empty wine bottle as he spoke. Most likely divination of some sort, Eldon answered. Finding magic is considered such, but there are those who have other sight that aren't just using art. There are those gifted individuals whom have these abilities as a part of their own person. Seers, I muttered the thought out loud. Perhaps, or clairvoyants as they are sometimes called in other circles. Would that be better than a magic user? Patrick stood and began to once more wander the room. Perhaps to the public. Sometimes it's thought of more respectably in polite society. But still, the main issue remains, as I believe, that such people would again be likely to be found amongst the members of the Stoneland Society. I have heard them say such about some of them anyways. It was obvious to me that Eldon had already decided that our only route forward was to return to the society and ask them for aid. His fascination with them was not well hidden. Patrick groaned and dropped his head into his hands dejectedly. You must understand something, Eldon. If we were known to have associated with the Stoneland group, and then it was discovered that they were a part of the killings, or even any bizarre activities in the city, it would be catastrophic for us. He turned and held out his hands as if pleading. Eldon had only an inkling of Patrick's true nature, but I knew well his absolute adherence to a rigid moral doctrine which reached well beyond the simple rules of being a watchman. As a child, Patrick had idolized his father to the point of elevating his memory into a mythic status of heroism. I, too, had a similar view of my own, but losing my mother as well, and having relied heavily on my sister, had made my image of my parents as somewhat jilted and shadowed. In the years after the death of his father, Patrick's mother, through her considerable mourning and need to preserve her husband's memory to her children, had made the elder Sistine somewhat deified. All was well, but for the end result that Patrick had developed a profound need to try and live up to the imagined standard of his dad. Patrick was not just trying to do what was right in his decisions. He was reaching to make himself on par with the level of goodness and morality of this hero, whether it was real or no. He would not sacrifice his reputation or honor. Is there no other way that you can think? His eyes met Eldon's clear, icy stare. Okay, let's think. Eldon walked past Patrick, patting him on the shoulder as he made his way to the steps leading up to the lab. I shrugged, and we followed as Eldon began wandering amongst the shelves of books on cluttered large tables, lighting lanterns and pausing only to give light to a long clay pipe from which he took only a single long puff of suspicious-smelling smoke. After a moment, he began muttering to himself and brought forth a great stained scroll on which he unfurled onto the only open space on the middle table. I realized it was a map of the city, complete with notes scribbled over a great many locations that I soon remembered from the past few months as robbery points. This was the map Eldon had been used to help plan his crimes. He saw the look on our faces and coughed awkwardly. It's an excellent map. I didn't have the heart to throw it away, but I assure you its criminal purpose is a thing of the past. Whatever, Eldo. What are you thinking, mate? Patrick sighed. Well, Tills is saying that the spirit of a thunder priest is tormenting his dreams. Correct, I answered, suddenly feeling a chill. What if she's already given you more information than you can remember? Say what? I asked, and the chill grew icy over my skin. Well, what if you're blocking her with your conscious mind? She's not really there, I answered as my hands began trembling and my palms sweating. She's just a dream. What if she's not, Tilly? Eldon asked. What if she is actually still with you? She cannot be. She haunts the chapel, Patrick added quickly as he began to realize what Eldon was saying. Oh, but we know she was drawing energy from both of you. What if she has attached herself to you both, and you, my friend, are actively blocking her? But he sees spirits all the time. He's like a spectral magnet. Exactly. And how many have you seen since the night at the church? Oh, none really. But for these dreams. Eldon cocked an eyebrow at me. And the sudden sharp cold felt as if I would soon be seeing my own breath. So you think the priestess attached herself and Tills has been actively repressing her except for when he sleeps and she breaks through. And as he said these words, I felt as if the room was spinning. I do not feel ill, mates, I gasped as I steadied myself on the table with my hands. Something is very wrong. Aye, you're as pale as fallen snow, Tills, Pat said, gripping my shoulder. So what does that mean, Eldon? What do we do now? Simple. We have two problems. There may be a spirit attached to you, and you need information from that spirit. We're going to have a seance. You think she knows where the boy might be, I said through chattering teeth as I rubbed my numb, cold hands together. I think she might have been telling you all along. I would like to say, though, gentlemen, that if we proceed, I think it would be much safer if we ask for help from those that are more experienced in spiritualism. This is nothing a gutter mage and two soldiers should be attempting on their own. This is exactly the kind of thing that the Stoneden people could help with. We can't take that chance. What can you do, Eldon? Eldon shook his head at Patrick's words and looked at me with the most well-I-tried expression I had ever seen. I watched as Eldon froze like a pensive statue, his mouth becoming a straight line as he stared forward into space. First, Let me make sure that you understand what we are beginning here, gentlemen. Magic is not free, and it is always demands a price. Even the simple dalliances I perform can easily escalate into catastrophic circumstances. However, that being said, I will agree to attempt a diagnosis of this condition. I watched him walk to a large shelf laden with books, jars, and odd objects from which he withdrew a large ancient wooden jewelry box which he placed on the table. Reaching inside the collar of his shirt, he pulled forth an ancient tarnished metal key on a long silver chain hanging from his neck, which I had never noticed before. He unlocked the box and after rummaging for a few minutes produced a long leather cord on which hung a shining, white, clear, crystal-like glass. Closing the box and securing it, he returned it to the shelf and moved a tall white candle to the center of the table directly before me, and striking a match, lit it. After momentarily referencing a notebook covered in scribbles on the table, he turned and faced me with a most serious and almost morose expression. I need you to sit there and relax, Tills. Clear your mind and watch the flame. Patrick, just stand aside and try not to react, no matter the outcome. I require complete concentration, and any distraction will have consequence. Oh, of course. You've got it, Eldo, but what are you going to do? Patrick spoke with the utmost respect, and I detected no sarcasm or glibness in his voice at all, even though a narrow edge of anxiety crept into his tone. A simple divination, or clairvoyance to be more accurate. Eldon held the strange large crystal a few inches above the flame, and simultaneously began speaking strange words in a language I had never heard. It seemed as if the crystal was sparkling and spinning on the cord, and I saw that little globes of light were moving all around us in the darkness as if it were a prism held in the sunlight. However, now it seemed as if a light were glowing from the center of the diamond-like object and shining around me. All of a sudden, Eldon's chant changed from a monotonous phrase he had almost been singing, and he spoke a very clear, simple phrase in the same foreign speech. All of a sudden, the crystal stopped spinning on its cord, and it froze still as I was bathed in a bright, shining luminance that shone out from a facet of the crystal thing as if it were a ray aimed from a lantern. Then, as it ceased its movement, Eldon leaned forward and peered into the other side of the glass-like object and squinted. Patrick too leaned forward in wonder, and they both stood on the other side of the table, looking with great awe into the device. I myself could only see soothing, warm light shining out, with no small amount of comfort, until I saw Patrick's jaw drop and Eldon's eyes widen, his brow furrowing with worry. "What is it, mates?" I asked. What are you two looking at?" Patrick glanced over at Eldon, who seemed to have been struck silent. Then, looking back at me with so much concern, I immediately became afraid as he reached over and placed his hand on my shoulder. "Great high spirits, Tills," he began, and stopped, as if struggling to find the words he needed. "What does this mean, Eldon?" he whispered, as if I could not tell he was speaking of me, although directly before me. The strange cold was now an oppressive blanket over my flesh. Eldon coughed uncomfortably and croaked. It's what I feared. If you don't tell me what you're seeing right now, I'm going to take that crystal and shove it up your arse, Eldon. I tried to sound commanding, but once again it was as if my jaw were chattering with cold. It's the bloody ghost, Tills, Patrick said. The ghost? What do you mean? Every hair was standing on end, and I could not only felt cold, but tired and squeezed, as strange as it sounds. Are you saying... She's here, Tills, Eldon said. The hand holding the cord began to shake with nervousness. She's here? Where? I said in utter confusion, but a dread growing in my stomach, my breathing growing difficult as the knowledge began to alight in my thoughts. I knew. I had known all along. I could feel this truth all around me. The priestess is hanging on you like a shroud, Patrick finally confessed. We can see her, draped over you like a damned cloak of swirling mist. She is completely attached to you, Eldon's eyes wide with intense fear and yet curiosity. How is that possible? I asked, but I knew. She had grabbed me the night of the confrontation with the curseling. I had felt a massive shift in my world, my very reality. Your mind has initiated a very primal and basic self-defense mechanism against her assault. You blocked her and held her at bay by denying her presence. You created a wall that held her back, but at the same time it shut down the very gift which allowed you to sense her. I could see Eldon was growing increasingly fascinated, and it made me even more uncomfortable. What are you trying to say? You're not making any sense. I was growing angry, and my very instinct was to attack them with disbelief. Something very deep in my being was screaming to resist this idea. You're a damned medium, Telenosis, Eldon said slowly and exactly. You're like one of the Stoneland people, except you've repressed it, denied it. But it was always there, running like a machine in the background of your mind. I'd guess that because of that, you've never learned to consciously control it, so you're like a wild talent or something. I'm not an expert on this, but I assume that it has allowed this spirit to hijack your aura, and you have carried it since. She's speaking, Tills. Can you see her speaking? She's screaming something, Patrick said, his voice trembling. She thrashes and rives like a raging storm, Eldon added cryptically. What is she saying? I can't tell, but I'll bet you a gold note you do. This is madness, I shouted, and with a burst of emotion I reached forward and snatched the crystal as if to throw it. However, just as my hand touched the light, I felt a darkness envelop me like the waves of some shadowy ocean. Eldon screamed something, and they both leapt forward as the room began to fade and grow distant, like I was sinking into an abyss. All around me was a spiraling world of shadow, light, and sound, a vacuum of spirit swirling over my descent. I could hear her voice. I could hear her words speaking. A shout, a scream. I had heard it all along for weeks. I accepted that she was there, and in turn, she claimed my mind with her rage, with her demand. Clearly now, her voice echoing as if spoken in the church where I'd met her. You must find the boy, wretched watchman. He is lost in man's darkness, surrounded by dishonor and corruption. He is at the pit. He stands at the brink of the pit. Go to the pit and save him, watchman. He is at the pit in the darkness of men. He is with the fisher, and he is with the Flayer.